So, editing Courtney here. I made this video last week, and I just wanted to emphasize the importance of reading Indigenous literature, and especially in Canada. Recently, the leader of our opposition party, the leader of one of the major political parties in Canada, Erin O'Toole of the Conservative Party of Canada, was caught on tape talking to a conservative group of university students, saying that residential schools weren't that bad, and they just wanted to educate the population, and completely ignoring and denying the cultural genocide that occurred because of residential schools in Canada. So let me just tell you, if you're going to deny that the residential schools were incredibly horrible and were in fact a cultural genocide, then you can unsubscribe and not watch any of my videos again, because we do not hold that here. And enjoy the rest of the video, where I recommend some books by people who are survivors of residential schools. Thank you.
Hi BookTube. So I'm here today to kind of talk about a project that I'm going to be working on for 2021. It's an extension of a product that happened, started this month, this kind of, not at the beginning of the year, but kind of developed organically. And I believe it started in June or July of this year, where I decided to start reading one book, at least one book a month, by an Indigenous author. And I specify North America specifically for that, just because I wanted to focus on one area, and then eventually maybe this project will go on to include other Indigenous populations. Yeah, so I just want to state also that I'm just picking out 12 books, but that doesn't mean that I'm only going to be reading 12 books by Indigenous authors next year. These are just the 12 books that I'm picking out specifically to concentrate on, and they're by month, because that makes sense, because I want to read one book a month by an Indigenous author from North America. So January, we're beginning with Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, who is Ojibwe from the Wabaseemoong Independent Nations, and this is about Saul Indian Horse. He's looking back on his life as a Northern Ojibwe through residential school and through playing hockey. This seems like a very winter-themed book, so it's fitting for January. In February, I want to read Moccasin Square Gardens by Richard Van Camp, who is, I tried looking up the pronunciations of the different tribes, but I can say it in my brain. My tongue doesn't always agree, so I apologize if I mispronounce anything. And this is the Dogrib Tulacho from Dene Nation. And these are short stories. I actually picked this up at Word on the Street a while ago. And it's humor mixed with darkness, and I'm beginning a new adventure in exploring more short stories. I've kind of had a bad relationship with reading them, actually, just because I wasn't compelled to pick them up after finishing a story. But I have actually had success with a few short story collections in 2020, so I'm not as hesitant going forth into 2021 to pick up some short stories, especially if they're going to be humorous and dark. I like dark humor, so yeah, that sounds good. In March, I'm going to be picking up Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, and she's Lagueno Pueblo. And this is about a young Indigenous man who comes back after being a prisoner of war in Japan during World War II. He has PTSD, and he's looking for refuge in his family's tradition and their past. And I read a nonfiction about a man who was a prisoner of war in Japan, and oh golly, why is that name not coming to me? It was made into a movie. Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't remember the name. I'll put it on the screen here. Anyways, that was astounding. Just the stuff that happened in the Japanese prisoner of war camps was just horrible. So I have a bit of a background going into this, and I'm really interested to see, it's a fictional account of it, but to see it from another perspective, from an Indigenous perspective as well. Then in April, the booktube darling, Braiding Sweetgrass. Everyone seemed to have read that, and I haven't yet. So I'm going to remedy that. This is by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. So this is subtitled Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. So this is about using plants and animals as teachers to get a better understanding of our relationship with the rest of living things on Earth. And this is a nonfiction, and I've super been into nonfiction lately, and I'm really looking forward to reading some more nonfiction. I've read a lot of nonfiction for my Indigenous exploration, so I thought this will be definitely fitting. Hopefully it lives up to the hype. In May, I'll be reading Up Ghost River by Edmund Metatawabin, who's a former chief of the Fort Albany First Nation, which is a Cree First Nation reservation. And this is the memoir of a residential school survivor. And I read other memoirs as well last year about the residential school program. And this also concentrates also on the process he goes through to heal from that experience and the lingering effects of that experience as well. So if you don't know about the residential school program, stop this video and just go Google it, because you'll get the answers there. But in a basic summary, Canada scooped up a bunch of kids, Indigenous kids, like it was legally required for these kids to be put into these schools, where it was trying to get the Indian out of the child. So they weren't allowed to speak their language, they weren't allowed to talk about their culture, they weren't allowed to have their hair long and in braids. It was, and they were beat and they were abused in all sorts of ways. It's just a horrific thing that is in Canada history that doesn't get talked about enough. So I'm very grateful that the survivors are able to write these memoirs and to share their stories and to share this history and expose this history. In June, I'll be reading God is Red by Vine Deloria Jr., and he's part of the Standing Rock Sioux, and this is subtitled A Native View of Religion. It's about embracing being a part of nature and not apart from nature, is what I got from reading descriptions about this book. In July, I'll be reading Peace Pipe Dreams by Darrell from the Secwepemc Nation. It's subtitled The Truth About Lies About Indians. It's supposed to be humorous and irreverent, which appeals to me greatly. It tackles funny questions and myths, but also kind of tougher questions about misconceptions around Indigenous people. And I really appreciate adding that touch of humor to it. I always find that helps me learn better about difficult things. And I think that's a good way of getting information across to people who might be hesitant about learning these things. I'm not hesitant about learning about these things, but I think it's good to have that in kind of like your database if you're ever going to argue with someone. In August, I'll be reading Where White Men Fear to Tread by Russell Means from the Oglala Lakota, and it's his autobiography. He's been called one of the most controversial Indigenous leaders of modern times. He stormed Mount Rushmore, he led a takeover of Wounded Knee, he ran for president, so he has this really interesting past, and I think it'll be really interesting to read about his story. In September, I'll be reading Legacy by Suzanne Methot. She is Nahiya, and it explores the effects of intergenerational trauma and how to heal from it. So it's a memoir. It's a nonfiction. In October, I'm going to be trying to read some more creepy, horror, scary type stuff, but not too scary, hopefully. And I'll be reading The Only Good Indian by Stephen Graham Jones, who's Blackfeet. And this is a horror that became quite popular this year. So I look forward to reading it in the coming year. This follows 4 men after a disturbing event from their youth comes back to haunt them. And you'll notice that my descriptions are quite vague because I don't like to know a lot before going into books. Sometimes it is just that vagueness that kind of appeals to me. Sometimes it's just the cover, the name, The Only Good Indian. There is a quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," which is, horrible, but I wonder if that's going to come play into this book. I have to wait until October to find out, though. In November, I'll be reading On/Me by Francine Cunningham, who is Cree and Métis, and this is a book of poetry about a white passing city-raised Indigenous woman who feels like she doesn't really fit in anywhere because there is a lot of difference between being raised on a reservation, or even just having access to going to a reservation growing up, and being raised, you know, in an urban area, and then being white passing. So she has this identity as this Cree Métis woman, but she doesn't look like it or have the typical experiences of a Cree or Métis person. So it'll be really interesting to read from her. It'll be really interesting to read from her perspective. And lastly, in December, I'll be reading In My Own Moccasins by Helen Knott, and she is Dainza, Nahiwa, and Métis. And this is a memoir, and it seems to be a really tough memoir, dealing with the history of addiction, intergenerational trauma, sexual violence, and her coming through it, obviously, because she was able to write this memoir and look back and self-reflect on it. Yeah, those are just 12 of the books by Indigenous authors that I plan on reading in 2021. Let me know if you have any other recommendations for me down below, and thank you for watching.